"Don't go that way," Malik Thompson called out, his voice cutting through the humid evening air as the low hum of a luxury engine rolled past him. Too smooth, too quiet for a street like this, the kind of street where flickering lights buzzed overhead and shadows stretched longer than they should under broken lamps. But the driver didn't slow down, didn't even glance his way, and Malik felt that familiar pull in his chest. The same instinct that had learned the language of danger long before he ever learned how to drive, the kind that didn't shout but pressed quietly, insistently, like a hand against his ribs saying move, now, before it's too late. And for a second he hesitated, sneakers planted against cracked pavement still warm from the day's heat, watching the polished black car glide deeper into the narrow side street where silence replaced traffic and even the distant siren seemed to fade, like the world itself was stepping back. But Malik exhaled once, sharp and steady, then started forward, not running yet, just walking fast, eyes locked on the vehicle as it slowed near the bend where the streetlights didn't quite reach, where everything turned a shade darker, where shapes blurred at the edges, and something about that, about how wrong it felt, made his pace quicken until it turned into a jog, then a sprint, his breath pulling tight in his chest as the engine idled ahead, the car now completely still, like it had wandered into a place it didn't belong and realized it too late, and Malik raised his hand, waving, calling out again, louder this time, his voice echoing faintly against the brick walls that lined the alley. "Hey! You don't want to be here!" But the windows stayed up, tinted and unreadable, the driver just a silhouette behind the wheel, and Malik closed the distance, his footsteps sharp against the pavement, heart pounding not from fear but from something deeper, something rooted in memory, in loss, in knowing what happens when people don't listen in time. And as he reached the side of the car, the faint glow from a nearby flickering bulb caught the edge of his face, sweat beading along his brow. Eyes focused, steady, and he knocked once on the glass, firm but not aggressive, just enough to be heard, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to pause, the air thick, the street holding its breath, until the window slid down just a few inches, revealing a man inside, older, composed, dressed in quiet elegance that didn't match the surroundings, his expression calm but curious, like he hadn't yet realized the weight of where he'd stopped, and Malik leaned in just enough for his voice to carry. Not panicked, not loud, just certain. "Sir, you need to turn around. This street isn't safe after dark," and the man studied him, eyes narrowing slightly, not in distrust but in consideration, as if measuring the sincerity behind the words, and for a second longer, the world held still between them, a teenager in worn sneakers and a stranger in a car worth more than anything on the block, separated by glass and circumstance, yet connected by a single moment where one chose to speak and the other had to decide whether to listen, and somewhere above them, the light flickered again, casting brief shadows across the hood of the car, like time itself was nudging forward, waiting for what would happen next. Malik did not step back when the man lowered the window a little more, the faint scent of leather and cool air from inside the car brushing against the heat of the street, and for a brief second, the contrast felt almost unreal, like two different worlds pressing against each other without quite touching, but Malik kept his voice steady, not pushing, not pleading, just offering the kind of warning he wished someone had given his brother years ago. "You took a wrong turn, sir. It happens, but this block is not what it looks like," and the man inside the car studied him more closely now, his gaze sharpening with quiet curiosity rather than fear, as if he was used to being the one in control of every situation he entered, even unfamiliar ones, and yet something about Malik's tone, about the absence of panic or exaggeration, made him pause longer than he normally would, his hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, fingers still, while the soft ticking of the engine cooling filled the silence between them, and Malik noticed the details without trying to, the clean lines of the dashboard, the subtle gleam of a watch at the man's wrist, the kind of details that spoke of a life far removed from late shifts and counting tips just to cover groceries, but none of that changed the urgency in his chest, none of it made him hesitate, because to Malik, this was not about who the man was, it was about where he was, and what could happen if he stayed, and he shifted slightly, glancing down the dim stretch of road behind the car where the darkness seemed to settle heavier, like something waiting, then back to the driver. "If you turn around now, you will be back on Maple Avenue in less than 2 minutes. There is a gas station on the corner, bright lights, open all night. Safer place to stop if you need directions," and his words were simple, practical, grounded in the kind of awareness that came from growing up here, from knowing which streets changed after sunset and which ones held their shape, and the man exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if weighing not just the information but the person delivering it, and Malik could feel that moment stretching. That invisible line where a stranger decides whether to trust someone who looks like him, dressed like him, standing under a flickering streetlight with worn sneakers and a voice that did not demand attention but earned it, and for a fraction of a second, Malik thought of walking away, of letting the decision rest entirely with the man inside the car, because he had done his part, he had said what needed to be said, but something in him held his ground, not stubbornness, not pride. Just a quiet sense of responsibility that had followed him since he was old enough to recognize how quickly things could go wrong when no one spoke up, and the man finally nodded once, slow and deliberate, his expression shifting in a way that suggested respect more than agreement, and his hand moved, turning the wheel slightly as the engine hummed back to life, and Malik stepped back just enough to give the car space, his shoulders relaxing by a fraction, though his eyes stayed alert, watching until the vehicle began to reverse, inch by careful inch. The headlights sweeping across the cracked pavement and faded walls, bringing brief clarity to corners that had been hidden seconds before, and as the car angled back toward the main road, the man lowered the window a little further, just enough to speak clearly, "What is your name?" And Malik hesitated, not out of fear but out of habit, because names had weight where he came from, they tied you to things, to places, to stories you did not always want strangers to carry, but he answered anyway. Voice even, Malik, and the man nodded again, as if committing it to memory, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need explanation, and then the window rose smoothly, sealing the quiet exchange inside the car as it completed its turn and rolled back toward the brighter end of the street, leaving Malik standing under the flickering light, the sound of the engine fading into the distance, and the night slowly settling back into place around him. As if nothing had happened at all. The sound of the engine faded completely, leaving only the soft buzz of the overhead light and the distant hum of traffic from Maple Avenue, and Malik stood there for a moment longer than necessary, eyes fixed on the empty stretch of road as if making sure the car had truly made it out, as if part of him expected it to return, but it did not, and the night slowly resumed its rhythm, quiet and uneven, like a city exhaling after holding its breath, and Malik let his shoulders drop, the tension easing from his frame in a slow, controlled release before he turned back toward the corner where the gas station lights glowed steady and bright, a small island of clarity in a neighborhood that shifted with the hour, and as he walked, his steps were unhurried now, the urgency replaced by a familiar calm, the kind that came after doing what felt right even when no one asked for it, even when no one noticed, and he pushed open the glass door with a soft chime, stepping into the cool air inside, where the scent of coffee and motor oil lingered faintly, and the cashier glanced up briefly before returning to his phone, the television mounted in the corner playing a muted news segment that scrolled headlines no one in the room was really watching, and Malik moved behind the counter, tying his apron tighter around his waist, his shift not quite over yet, not until the clock edged past 10:30, and he reached for the rag he had left folded near the register, wiping down the surface in slow, practice motions, his mind already settling back into routine, but something lingered, not worry. Not even curiosity exactly, just a quiet echo of the moment that had passed, the look in the man's eyes when he said his name, the way he had listened without interruption, without dismissal, and Malik was not used to that, not from people like him, people who carried themselves with that kind of quiet certainty, and he shook the thought away gently, focusing instead on the small tasks in front of him, the steady rhythm of work that kept everything grounded, because that was how he had learned to move through life. One shift at a time, one decision at a time. Without expecting anything in return, and outside, the night stretched on, cars passing occasionally, headlights sweeping across the windows in brief flashes of white and gold, and inside, the minutes ticked forward, slow but consistent, until the door chimed again and a customer stepped in, then another, each one blending into the next, until the earlier moment began to feel like something distant, something that belonged to another part of the night. And when his shift finally ended, Malik untied his apron, folding it neatly before placing it on the counter, nodding once to the cashier as he stepped back out into the warm air, the sky above a deep shade of blue fading toward black, and he started down the sidewalk toward home, hands in his pockets, his pace easy, unaware that somewhere across the city, in a place filled with glass walls and quiet voices, the man from the car had already spoken his name out loud again. Not as a question this time, but as something remembered. Something that mattered, and the distance between those two worlds, between that street and whatever waited beyond it, had already begun to shift in ways Malik could not yet see. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the sky pale and quiet as early light slipped through the thin curtains of Malik's room, casting soft lines across the worn floorboards, and for a few seconds he lay still, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood waking up, a distant car engine, footsteps on the sidewalk, the low hum of someone opening a storefront down the block, all of it steady, predictable, grounding, and he pushed himself up, running a hand over his face as the memory of the night before flickered briefly through his mind, not as something dramatic, but as a simple moment, a decision made and left behind, and he moved through his routine without urgency, pulling on a clean shirt, lacing his sneakers, stepping into the small kitchen where his mother had already left a plate covered with foil on the counter, still warm enough to carry the scent of eggs and toast, and a note written in careful handwriting sat beside it, reminding him to eat before school, to stay focused, to keep going, the same word she always left, steady as everything else in his life, and Malik ate quietly, eyes drifting to the window where the street looked different in daylight, less threatening, almost ordinary, as if the shadows from the night had never existed, and when he stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the heat not yet settled in, the sun reflecting off windows and cars with a brightness that made everything seem clearer than it really was, and he walked the familiar route toward the bus stop. Passing the gas station where he had worked just hours before, now bustling with morning customers, the same place but somehow not the same moment, and he did not stop, did not think much of it, just kept moving forward, because that was what he knew how to do, and across the city, far from the cracked sidewalks and flickering lights, inside a building of glass and steel where every surface reflected precision and control, Edward Hale stood near a wide window overlooking streets that looked smaller from above, his posture still, his expression unreadable, while a quiet tension settled in the room behind him, assistants moving carefully, voices low, as if aware that something had shifted even if they did not fully understand what, and on the polished table beside him lay a simple note with one word written clearly, Malik, and Edward's gaze remained fixed on the horizon for a moment longer before he turned, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made everyone in the room straighten slightly. Find him, he said, not loudly, not urgently, but with a certainty that did not leave room for delay, and a man near the table nodded quickly, already reaching for a tablet, fingers moving with practiced efficiency, pulling up maps, security feeds, time stamps, tracing the route from the previous night back to the place where a decision had been made by someone who did not know who he was helping, and Edward stepped closer to the table, eyes scanning the information as it appeared, his mind not on the mistake of the wrong turn but on the person who had corrected it, on the voice that had carried no fear, no expectation, just clarity, and in a world where most interactions came with agendas and calculations, that simplicity stood out more than anything else, and as the search began to narrow, as a location appeared, a small gas station on Maple Avenue, Edward's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not into a smile, not into relief, but into something quieter, something closer to recognition, and miles away, unaware of the movement already set in motion, Malik took his seat on the bus, staring out the window as the city passed by in fragments of color and motion, his reflection faint against the glass, steady and unassuming, not knowing that the simple act of speaking up the night before had already begun to reach far beyond the dimly lit street, into places he had never seen, carried by someone who had listened. By midday, the rhythm of the school day had settled into its usual pattern, the low murmur of voices in the hallway, lockers opening and closing, the distant echo of a bell marking time that always seemed to move slower inside those walls, and Malik sat near the back of his classroom, one hand resting lightly on his notebook while sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long, quiet lines across the desks, but his focus drifted in and out. Not distracted in the way teachers warned about, just pulled slightly off-center, like something unseen had shifted the balance of the day without making a sound, and when the announcement came over the intercom, it cut cleanly through the room, precise and formal, asking for Malik Thompson to report to the front office. A few heads turned, a few whispers followed, the kind that always came with being called out of class, and Malik looked up slowly, a faint crease forming between his brows, not fear, not even concern yet, just uncertainty, because moments like that rarely meant anything simple, and he closed his notebook carefully before standing, his chair sliding back with a soft scrape against the floor, the teacher giving him a brief nod that said go ahead without asking questions, and the walk down the hallway felt longer than usual, each step echoing faintly as the noise of the classroom faded behind him, replaced by a quieter stillness that settled around the administrative offices, and when he pushed open the door, the cool air inside carried a different kind of silence, one that felt measured, controlled, and the receptionist looked up immediately, her expression shifting in a way he could not quite read, polite but distant, as if she had already been expecting him, and she gestured toward the principal's office without speaking much, just a simple, "They are waiting for you," and that word lingered in his mind. They, not he, not the principal alone, but something more, and Malik's step slowed just slightly as he approached the closed door, his hand pausing for half a second before knocking, the sound soft but clear, and when the door opened, the first thing he noticed was not the principal, not the desk, but the presence of two men standing near the window, both dressed in tailored suits that seemed out of place in a building filled with worn textbooks and scuffed floors, their posture straight, their attention already on him as if he had walked into something already in motion, and the principal cleared his throat gently, offering a brief introduction that did little to explain anything, his voice careful, measured. "Malik, these gentlemen would like to speak with you," and Malik stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a quiet click that felt louder than it should have, sealing the room in a moment that suddenly felt heavier than the rest of the day, and one of the men stepped forward slightly, not imposing, not aggressive, just composed, holding a tablet in one hand, his eyes steady as they met Malik's, and for a brief second, Malik felt that same unfamiliar sensation from the night before, that feeling of being seen not as a student, not as someone passing through a system, but as someone being looked for, and the man spoke calmly, his tone respectful but direct. "We would like to ask you about something that happened last night," and Malik's mind moved quickly, retracing the hours, the shift, the street, the car, the moment that had seemed so small at the time, and now stood in front of him like something else entirely, something that had followed him into this room without warning, and he did not speak. Immediately, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, but inside, a quiet tension began to form, not from guilt, not from fear, but from the simple realization that whatever this was, it was no longer just a moment left behind on a dimly lit street, it had come back for him, and it was asking to be understood. Malik stood still for a moment after the man finished speaking, the words settling into the quiet space of the office like something heavier than they sounded, and he shifted his weight slightly, his eyes moving from one face to the other, not searching for answers but measuring tone, posture, intent, the way he had learned to do without thinking, and the room itself felt different now, the sunlight coming through the window no longer soft but sharp, casting defined edges across the polished desk and the floor, as if everything had been brought into clearer focus without warning, and Malik finally nodded once, slow and controlled. "I was working last night," he said, his voice even, steady, not defensive, not eager, just factual, and the man with the tablet tapped lightly on the screen, confirming something before looking back up at the gas station on Maple Avenue, he added, and Malik gave a small nod, his hands relaxed at his sides, though his fingers curled slightly inward, not from fear but from the quiet tension of being observed, of being placed into a moment that seemed to matter more to them than it ever had to him, and the second man, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward just enough to speak, his tone calm, almost reassuring. "Do you remember speaking to someone in a black car near the East Alley around 9:45, and Malik's gaze held steady, the memory immediate, clear, not something he needed to search for. "Yes," he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to shape the answer into something else, just truth as he understood it, and the men exchanged a brief glance, not surprised but acknowledging, and the man with the tablet continued, "Can you tell us what happened?" And Malik inhaled quietly, not deeply, just enough to gather his thoughts, and for a moment the sounds of the hallway outside seemed to fade completely, leaving only the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the office, marking time in a way that felt slower than usual, and he spoke again, choosing his words carefully but without overthinking them. He turned down the wrong street. "I told him it was not safe to stay there. I showed him how to get back to Maple Avenue," and as he spoke, the simplicity of it seemed almost out of place in the room, like the explanation did not match the attention it had drawn, and the second man nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Did he say anything else to you?" And Malik paused for a fraction of a second, recalling the moment the window had lowered, the brief exchange that followed. "He asked my name," he said, and the man's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition, as if that detail carried weight, and the room fell into a quiet stillness again, not empty but full, like something unseen was aligning behind the conversation, and Malik remained where he stood, posture straight but not rigid, his gaze steady, and in that moment he felt neither small nor elevated, just present, grounded in what he knew and what he had done, and whatever this was, whatever direction it was moving, he was not trying to control it, not trying to anticipate it, he was simply standing in it, letting it unfold, and the man with the tablet lowered it slightly, his voice softer now, almost respectful. "Malik, the person you spoke to last night has requested to meet you," and the words did not come with explanation, did not come with context, they simply existed in the air between them, and Malik blinked once. Not in confusion but in quiet processing, because nothing about that request made immediate sense, not in his world, not in the rhythm of his life, and yet something about the tone, about the way it was said, suggested that this was not a question of whether he understood it, but whether he was ready to step into something he had never expected, and for a brief moment, the light shifted again across the room, the angle changing just enough to catch the edge of the desk and reflect it toward him, bright and steady, as if marking the exact point where an ordinary moment ended and something else, something unknown, began. Malik did not answer right away, not because he did not hear the request, but because of the way it settled in his chest, unfamiliar and quiet at the same time, like a door opening in a place he had never expected to walk through, and he glanced briefly toward the principal, who offered no explanation, only a small nod that seemed to say this was real, whatever it was, and Malik shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself in the moment before speaking. "Why?" he asked, not challenging, not hesitant, just direct, and the man with the tablet paused, as if choosing his next words carefully, then lowered the device completely, giving Malik his full attention. "Because you helped him," he said, and the simplicity of that answer lingered in the air, almost too simple for the weight it carried, and Malik's brow tightened just slightly, not in confusion but in quiet disbelief. Because people did not usually come looking for you over something like that, not where he came from, not for doing what felt like the obvious thing, and the second man stepped in gently, his voice softer now, more human, less formal. "He was not supposed to be in that area last night. You made sure he left before anything could go wrong," and Malik's gaze held steady, but something shifted behind his eyes, not fear, not pride, just a subtle awareness that the moment he had already placed behind him had not been as small as he thought, and the room seemed to grow quieter around that realization, the ticking clock more noticeable now, the faint sounds of the hallway distant and muted, and Malik exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just enough to show he was thinking, not resisting, and the man continued, "His name is Edward Hale," and the name landed differently, not because Malik recognized it immediately, but because of the way it was said, with a quiet weight that suggested it carried more than just identity, and Malik's eyes narrowed slightly, searching his memory, and the second man added, "He is the founder of Hale Industries," and that was when it connected, not fully, not with details, but enough to understand the scale, the kind of name that appeared in headlines, in conversations that felt distant from everyday life, the kind of person who existed in a world Malik had only ever seen from the outside, and for a brief second, the image of the man in the car shifted in his mind, not changing who he was, but adding a layer Malik had not seen, and the realization did not make Malik step back, did not make him speak differently, it simply settled into place, quiet and steady, like everything else he processed, and the man watched him closely, as if expecting a reaction, surprise, disbelief, something more visible, but Malik only nodded once, slow and measured. "Okay," he said, and that single word carried no exaggeration, no attempt to impress or dismiss, just acceptance of what had been said, and the second man allowed a faint breath of relief, almost imperceptible, before continuing, "He would like to meet you today, if you are willing," and the offer hung in the air, not forced, not rushed, just present, and Malik looked toward the window for a brief moment, the sunlight now brighter, sharper against the glass, casting reflections that blurred the outside world into something distant, and in that reflection, he saw himself as he was, a student, a worker, someone who had made a simple decision the night before, and now stood at the edge of something unfamiliar, and he turned back, his expression unchanged, calm, grounded. "I can go after school," he said, and the men exchanged a brief glance, a silent agreement passing between them, and the man with the tablet nodded. "That will work," he replied, his tone respectful, and as the moment settled, Malik realized something quietly, something that did not need to be said out loud, that whatever waited after school was not about who the man was, or what he owned, it was about a moment where one person chose to listen, and another chose to speak, and somehow, that had been enough to change the direction of both their days, and now, it was about to change something more The rest of the school day moved differently after that, not faster, not slower, just quieter in a way Malik could not fully explain, like everything around him continued as usual while something beneath it had shifted, and when the final bell rang, the sharp sound echoed through the halls, releasing students into the late afternoon light, voices rising, footsteps quickening, but Malik walked at his own pace, steady and composed, his mind not racing ahead but staying anchored in the present. And outside, near the curb where buses lined up in uneven rows, a black sedan waited, polished and still, its presence subtle but unmistakable among the older cars and passing traffic, and one of the men from earlier stood beside it, posture relaxed yet attentive, and when Malik approached, the man opened the rear door without a word, not as an order, not even as an expectation, just an invitation, and Malik paused for a brief second, not out of hesitation but out of awareness, taking in the moment fully before stepping inside, the door closing softly behind him, sealing out the noise of the street and replacing it with a calm, controlled silence, and the interior felt cool, composed, every detail intentional, and the car began to move without urgency, merging into traffic as the city unfolded outside the window in familiar patterns that gradually shifted into something less familiar, buildings growing taller, streets cleaner, the rhythm more structured, and Malik watched without staring, his reflection faint in the glass, steady and grounded, and when the car finally slowed and turned into a wide driveway framed by glass and steel, the building ahead rose with quiet authority, its surface catching the light in clean, reflective lines, and the vehicle came to a smooth stop beneath a covered entrance where everything seemed to operate with quiet precision, and the door opened again, and Malik stepped out, his sneakers meeting polished stone that reflected the sky above, and inside, the space expanded into a high-ceiling lobby filled with soft light and controlled movement, people passing by with purpose but without noise, their voices low, their steps measured, and Malik followed the man through the space, past a reception desk where a brief glance was all it took for access to be granted, into an elevator that rose smoothly without a sound, numbers lighting up one by one as the city dropped away below. And when the doors opened, the floor they stepped onto was quieter still, the air carrying a kind of stillness that felt intentional, and at the end of a long corridor lined with glass walls and soft reflections, a single office stood with its door partially open, and the man paused just outside, turning slightly toward Malik. "He is inside," he said, his voice calm, respectful. And Malik nodded once, his expression unchanged, and as he stepped forward, the world seemed to narrow into that doorway, the light inside warmer, softer, and the figure standing near the window turned slowly at the sound of his footsteps, the same man from the car, but now fully seen, fully placed within his world, Edward Hale, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled not with tension but with recognition, and Edward took a step closer, not distant, not elevated, just present, his voice steady, carrying something quieter than authority, something closer to sincerity. "You told me to turn around," he said, and Malik met his gaze without flinching, his voice just as calm. "Yes, sir," and Edward nodded once, a small motion that seemed to hold more weight than it should. "You were right," he said, and the word settled into the room, simple and clear, and in that moment, the distance between who they were and where they came from did not disappear, but it shifted, just enough to make space for something else, something built not on status or expectation, but on a single moment where one chose to speak and the other chose to listen. Edward did not rush the moment, did not fill the silence with explanations or formalities, he simply stood there for a second longer, allowing the weight of what had happened to exist between them without interruption, and then he gestured subtly toward the seating area near the window where the light fell softer across the floor, and Malik stepped forward, his movements calm and measured, taking in the space without staring, without shrinking, just observing as he always did, and they sat across from each other, not as strangers anymore but not yet as anything defined, and Edward leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed in a way that did not match the reputation he carried, and when he spoke again, his voice held a quiet honesty that did not feel rehearsed. "Most people would not have stopped," he said, not as a compliment, not as a test, just a statement, and Malik listened without reacting immediately, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his gaze steady, and after a brief pause he answered simply, "It was the right thing to do," and Edward's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in doubt but in recognition, as if that answer confirmed something he had already begun to understand, and he nodded once, slower this time. "That is rare," he replied, and for a moment neither of them spoke again, the city stretching out beyond the glass in quiet motion, cars moving far below like distant patterns, and Edward reached for a folder resting on the table beside him, opening it carefully, not with urgency but with intention, and he turned it slightly so that Malik could see. Documents inside, clean, precise, the kind that carried decisions within them, and his voice remained even, grounded. I have spent years building systems that are supposed to prevent mistakes, but last night, none of that mattered. One wrong turn, and I was somewhere I did not understand, he said, and Malik's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened, not on the words themselves but on the meaning behind them, and Edward continued, you did not know who I was, you did not ask, you did not hesitate, you simply made sure I turned back, and he closed the folder halfway, resting his hand on it. That matters more than you realize. And Malik shifted slightly, not uncomfortable, just adjusting to the weight of the conversation, because where he came from, doing the right thing was not something people rewarded, it was something you carried quietly, and Edward seemed to understand that without needing it explained, and after a brief pause, he spoke again, I want to make sure that moment does not end where it started, and he turned the folder fully now, sliding it gently across the table, and Malik looked down, his eye scanning the first page slowly, taking in the words, the offer, something about education, about opportunity, about a path that extended far beyond the streets he knew, and he did not react immediately, did not show surprise or disbelief, he simply read, carefully, line by line, as if grounding himself in what was real before allowing it to become something more, and Edward watched him, not expecting gratitude, not expecting anything immediate, just waiting. And after a moment, Malik looked up, his expression calm, unchanged on the surface, but steadier somehow, like something inside him had aligned with what he was seeing, and he spoke quietly, you do not have to do this, and Edward gave a small shake of his head, almost imperceptible. I know, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no performance, just certainty, and the room fell into a stillness that did not feel empty, but complete, like something had reached its natural place without force. And outside, the light shifted again,